Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So in this video, we are going to look at Bayonet Charge, 1957 by Ted Hughes. So this is a poem about a charge in battle in World War One. It is based on the experiences of Ted Hughes' father. Ted himself did spend 2 years in the RAF as a mechanic, but did not experience war. And there's Ted Hughes himself. So 1930 to 1998, born in Yorkshire, England. His father fought in World War One. His mother bought him a small second-hand library of poetry after he was praised by his English teacher. He was very interested in nature. He went to Cambridge University to study English, but switched to archaeology and anthropology. So you can see quite an unusual background compared to some of the other poets in the anthology. He was married to Sylvia Plath, so she's a very famous poet in her own right. Sadly, she committed suicide, but that's not relevant to this poem. And his first book of poetry, Hawk in the Rain, won a prize. You may have read some of these poems in your earlier years, maybe even in primary school. And his writing is immensely varied and almost always passionately concerned with the relationship between nature and industry. So, although this is a war poem, you will see there is a connection to nature in the poem. And in 1984, he became Poet Laureate. So, if you remember, this means the national poet. So, as always, here is the glossary for the poem. Please pause the video here and try to learn these words, or at least read through them 2 or 3 times. It is quite a difficult poem, so I would really urge you and recommend you to at least read through these words 2 or 3 times, because the poem is difficult enough, even leaving aside the difficult words. And these are all the techniques that he uses, and you can see there's quite a lot of them. So there's the poem. Let's listen to an audio version, and then we'll go through it line by line.
Suddenly, he awoke and was running. Raw in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. Hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air, he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the center of his chest. In bewilderment, then he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows through up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle. Its mouth wide open, silent, his eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honor, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air. His terror's touchy dynamite.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that reading. It's a little bit different, that reading. I quite liked it when I found it on YouTube, so I thought I would use that one. Okay, so this is quite a tricky poem. What we're going to do is we're going to go through it this first time, just making sure we understand basically what's going on. And then in the second reading, we'll go into it in more detail. So it starts in what we call in media res, which is Latin for in the middle of the action or in the middle of things. But when it comes to stories and things, we translate it as in the middle of the action. So suddenly he awoke. I mean, this is straight away the confusion starts because you wouldn't have thought he'd be sleeping at this point, but maybe he just means that he's dazed. When you're in a war, your mind is obviously not very clear, and he finds himself running. Now, the other thing I should say at this point is that there seems to be a debate as to whether this is just one soldier or a group of soldiers. What I mean is, this particular poem is about one soldier. But I do think that there would be other soldiers there. He wouldn't really be running by himself. And probably there's lots of enemy soldiers as well, because later on, when we see this line here about the rifle fire, it can't be just one soldier. But that's something we can maybe talk about again later on. And then it says, repeats the word raw here and here. So that's important. So seams are the stitches that hold your clothes together. So the point that the poet is making is, so raw can mean uncooked, inexperienced. Yeah. So the point he's making here is that the soldier is inexperienced and his clothes have been roughly sewn together. So in the First World War, this was one of the common complaints that soldiers were sent out to battle with not much training and not properly equipped. And then here we have an oxymoron because obviously sweat itself can't be heavy. However, it could be literal in the sense that, and it's sort of a metaphor, but in a way it could be literal that he's sweating so much that he can feel it, it's heavy. And notice also Hughes uses lots of words which are to do with inexperience. Okay, so this raw and then the stumbling. So this soldier clearly is not a very experienced, well-trained soldier. And also the word suddenly there suggests there's no real plan here. So he's running across the field. This means lumps of mud towards a green hedge. So that could be the target, but also notice the first reference to nature. Okay, so the poet doesn't just describe the soldier and war, he does describe the nature surroundings around the soldier, as you'll see later on as well. So dazzled with rifle fire, so that kind of means sparkling, but the point being that there's lots of rifle fire, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't think it can just be one soldier. And here's personification. So lots of bullets, and obviously air doesn't have a belly, but the effect is to show that there's lots of bullets and it's terrifying. The word lugged means to carry, but in a very kind of stumbling kind of way. So another word for inexperience, lack of training, and rifle. So he's got his rifle, and there's a simile here, which doesn't quite make sense, but in a way, that's the whole point, really. This whole part of the confusion of the poem reflects the confusion of the soldier, his lack of training, the lack of a plan, and patriotic tear, personification again. So we're going to find that the poem starts off patriotic, but ends unpatriotic. Not so much within the poem itself. I think this is actually referring maybe to when he first came out to the war, and he was probably very patriotic and crying tears of patriotism. But now that's going to change. And here's a simile and a metaphor because obviously tears don't come from the center of your chest, do they? They come from your eyes. Although you could argue that they do come from your heart in the sense that the emotion starts there and that creates tears to come, causes tears to come out of your eyes. And those tears are now like are burning him, not literally, but in terms of his terror and his fear. And here we have enjambment. So we have strong enjambment here. I mean, technically, the meaning of this sentence could stop there. You could have a full stop there, but notice that Ted Hughes hasn't got that. He's got a comma and then a dash. And in a way that reflects, the enjambment reflects what the next line says, that he almost stops, which is crazy because if he stops, he's more likely to be shot and killed. So this means extreme confusion. Now this line here, we're going to just skip for a minute, okay, until the next reading, because it's quite a tricky line. And then he carries on running. Here we have another simile, like a man who jumps up in the dark. Well, it's a simile, but it's also kind of literal, isn't it? And it could mean that, I mean, quite often these charges were in the morning, at dawn, when it was maybe still a bit dark, okay? And he's running, and this listening, I think, is metaphorical because he doesn't literally have time to listen right now. But the point being that he's thinking. It's not so much listening, but thinking or listening to his thoughts of why he's running. Why is he here? So again, that questioning shows that there doesn't seem to be any kind of a plan here, no kind of professional system in place. And here's another simile. So statuary is to do with statues. All right. So notice here that on the one hand, he's probably running very, very fast, but in situations like this, for example, with fear and so on, time seems to stand still, doesn't it? Or go in very slow motion. So that's what's happening here. And then shot slashed. So these are the gun shots. This means like ridges, trenches. So the shots are creating furrows, ridges, trenches in the mud. So here we have strong enjambment again. And in a way, that enjambment reflects the trenches, doesn't it? Now, this line is confusing when you first read the poem, if you don't understand that Hughes was really interested in nature and how war affected not just people, but animals and plant life as well. So this is literally talking about a hare, okay? And the poor thing has caught fire and is crawling around. Now, threshing has a number of meanings. It's a different spelling of thrashing, so moving around violently. But threshing also means it's an agricultural term when you separate grain out from other things, for example. You don't need to know the details. But the double meaning here is again a reference to nature, okay? And the hare's mouth is wide open, it's silent, its eyes are bulging out in pain, in agony, because it's on fire. And then plunged means to jump or dive, but it's normally kind of connotations of being all over the place. And there's alliteration here as well, plunged past. So remember, bayonet is the main word you should know. It's the knife that you stick at the end of a gun before you rush towards the enemy. So notice the green hedge again. So he's still running towards it. He hasn't got there yet. Now this line is really important. We've got a list, and basically by this point he's lost all sense of patriotism, courage, honor, and so on. King and country, and the etc. kind of adds to that effect of how meaningless these things are. Here we have another simile. So lots of similes and metaphors used here, personification, alliteration, enjambment. So all these things have become luxuries. They're not essential. Here we have onomatopoeia, yelling alarm. So he's yelling. And the blue crackling air. So again, this is to do with the rifle fire, the bullets. And this last line is also a bit tricky, but basically it doesn't mean anything literally. It's just creating this effect of his absolute terror. And there's alliteration there to add to that effect. And dynamite obviously meaning things that explode, explosives. I mentioned caesura, which this poem does use, but that's an advanced term that we'll talk about in the second reading. Okay, so quite a difficult poem, but hopefully you can understand that in simple terms, it's just describing this soldier charging in battle, and he's absolutely terrified. Okay, so AO1, to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem, using quotes and references. So lots of quotes there. And I'll put these ones together because these are just word classes, adjectives, adverbs, verbs, but also they're all similar in meaning in the sense of to do with inexperience. And here are the techniques. So this is what I've just said just now. So you might want to pause the video here and just check to make sure you understand what's happening here with these techniques. So I'm going to move on now. So AO2, language, form and structure using techniques and terminology. So language means words and phrases, and you have to talk about their effects, thoughts, feelings, images, and the connotations, alternative or suggestive meanings of a word. So we talked about the word raw, didn't we? And then in terms of form and structure, the poem is not of a specific form and does not have a regular rhyme or rhythm scheme, perhaps to match the confusion of war. Perhaps also because Hughes was quite an unconventional poet. So this means different, yeah, unusual. And it has 3 stanzas with quite strong enjambment between the stanzas. Each stanza has a specific focus as well as continuing the story of the soldier's thoughts. So what I mean by that is here, stanza 1 is about the starting of the charge. Here, he kind of pauses and thinks about why he's here. Here, I think there's 2 focuses. Number 1 is the hair, and then the second half is where he's lost all patriotism and so on. Okay, so techniques and terminology. Hughes uses many techniques, but especially simile metaphor, personification, and just simple word classes used really powerfully and effectively. And he also uses strong enjambment. And in terms of context, you could talk about the fact that it's based on his father's experiences, and he was very interested in nature, which explains the hair and so on in the poem, and his wide variety of poetry, which explains why, although most of his poetry is about nature, but given that his father was in the war and he's a poet, Ted Hughes, obviously he would want to write about that. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5, depending on how you write your essay. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. So please pause the video here and answer these questions. If you really struggle, you need to go back and listen again. I'm going to move on in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so here are the answers. Please pause the video and check your answers. And if you've got anything less than 50%, you really need to go back, but you're really aiming for 70, 90, 100%. And then once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. So you might get a question like this. How does the poet present the theme of war in Bayonet Charge compared with one other poem in the anthology? We're not going to do that here, but you could compare with Charge of the Light Brigade, which is what I would do. But you could compare with Exposure, which is also about war and very against war, you could say, and unpatriotic. But this one is obviously more about the weather. And you might start something like this. The poet presents the theme of war by describing a terrifying charge in battle using techniques such as personification. The poem begins patriotically but ends unpatriotically. The poem begins in media res, in the middle of the action. I mean, you don't need to write this actually, but I've just put it there just to remind you what that means. So this is Latin. With the adverb suddenly and the repetition of the adjective raw. Here, the adjective refers both to the fact that the clothes are not properly made and that the soldiers are not properly trained. This, combined with the adverb, shows that he has no idea what he is doing here, why, or how to do his job. There seems to be no plan. You might want to add that there. So something like that, 4 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion and a bit of context would be more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5. If you're aiming higher, let's carry on. So I think the tone, you could say, is very critical and unpatriotic, and the mood created is one of pity for the soldier and for the hare. You feel sorry for the soldier and very, very sorry for the poor little hare. In terms of rhyme and rhythm, there is no rhyming. So raw, heavy, hedge, hearing, air, arm, eye, chest, you can see no rhyme. And rhythm, you can count the syllables if you want, but just one simple way of seeing the rhythm is you can actually just see it, okay, in the length of the lines. So you can see very uneven lengths of lines. So both of those things reflecting the chaos of war, the pointlessness, the futility of war, perhaps. And in terms of language form and structure, let's have a look at this line that we skipped earlier. So it's a very difficult line, and there are various interpretations. I'm going to give you two, and you may have your own ideas. So remember, this is aiming for the higher grades now. So cold clockwork, for a start, there's alliteration. And stars is to do with fate and astrology, star signs, that kind of thing. And so basically, and then the fate of nations and the destiny of nations. So basically, what he's saying is, what is it about fate in general, my fate, and the fate of nations that has led me to this point in time, to this second in time? Okay, so there's the clock there. Also, clockwork, clocks in the old days, I mean, even now we have analog clocks which are mechanical. Obviously, they're moving more towards digital clocks, but analog clocks have mechanisms inside them. So, including cogs, which are little wheels that turn around. So, this might also mean that he feels like a cog in a machine. Okay. So, a very difficult line, but I've given you two possibilities there. In terms of form and structure, I think we've covered those with the rhyme and the rhythm, or the lack of, and how the poem changes from patriotic to unpatriotic. So that's to do with structure, remember, beginning, middle, and end, how the content is organized. And in terms of context, I don't think we need to say much more there. The only final thing I'll say about this line here, if you struggle with that line, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, sometimes in poetry, you shouldn't try to translate lines too literally. You should maybe think about the effect it has on you. And I would hope you would agree that the main point here is to show how terrified he is. Okay. And the alliteration adds to that. Okay. So here is the advanced quiz to test your understanding of what we've discussed about the advanced points. Please pause the video here and answer these questions. I'm going to move to the answer slide in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. And here are some possible answers. So please pause the video and check your answers. They don't have to be exactly the same. And if you missed out anything, then here's your chance to learn from this slide as well. Moving on in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough for a grade 6 or 7. Such a paragraph might look like this. So up to here is the same as before. And then I've added the next bit. Hughes wrote on a variety of things, and his father was in the war, so it is not surprising that he should write about war, although that was not the main focus of his poetry. Nature was the main focus of his writing, which explains the reference to the hare in this poem, which I otherwise might feel incongruous. This means out of place. So about 5, 6 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion, would be more than enough to get a grade 6 or 7. If you're aiming for the highest grades, then here are some suggestions. So I think this line here, if you can talk about this line, talk about the two interpretations I gave you, and if you have any other thoughts of your own. But even if you can just discuss those clearly in writing, that would be enough. It's not a question of coming up with an exact answer or necessarily a different answer. And I mean, this poem is quite tricky. There's lots of techniques going on. So you could discuss the effects of the regular, irregular rhyme and rhythm, the use of enjambment and caesura. Sorry, there was a slight mistake there. I've corrected that. So the use of enjambment and caesura, the semantic field of inexperience. So what I mean by that is, I mean, normally semantic field means groups of words from a given topic or subject. But what I mean is all those words about like suddenly and raw and stumbling. So we can call that semantic field of inexperience if you like. You could use the word synonyms, but they're not really synonyms. So that's why I've chosen this term here. And you could talk about how attitudes towards patriotism and war have changed over time. And if you want to do that, you might be interested in these words which increase in strength. So, patriotism means to love your country, but that doesn't stop you from loving other countries. Nationalism, again, is about loving your country, but and giving it like top attention, but still kind of accepting that other countries also have their place. But then jingoism is like an extreme where you almost turn against other countries. It's almost warlike. Okay. So you could look those words up in the dictionary as well, just to cement your understanding. And then once you've got your head around all that, you could try completing the essay we've started. How does the poet present the theme of war in Bayonet Charge? So a lot of things going on in this poem. So I've had to skip a few things, especially I didn't really explain the caesura. But if you're grade 8, 9 material, you should be able to work that out. And to be honest, you would be able to get a grade 8, 9, even if you didn't mention that, because there's so much else going on. Okay, so that's it. I hope you liked that video and found it useful. If so, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video for the next poem.